webinar on a regulatory puzzle, writing for the medical device industry. This is Sheba, and I'll be your co-host for tonight. Now I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Holly Mickelson, Senior Technical Writer at Brainlab SC. Based in Germany and with nearly 8 years of experience, Holly brings a diverse background in teaching, content creation, and editing with a special knack for spotting patterns in documentation to ensure consistency and clarity. And today, she'll be sharing practical strategies and examples to help you craft compliant yet user-focused IFUs. With that, I'll hand it over to Holly. The stage is yours.
Hello, my name is Holly Mickelson, and I am a senior technical writer at Brainlab, which is a medical device provider in Munich, Germany. We provide products that are both software or hardware, sometimes a mixture, and we sell those on an international basis. I want to start off by talking about something that I saw recently that's a little bit unrelated, but I think you'll see where I'm going with this. I was watching TV, and they were actually showing people's unusual hobbies. And this one person was very into puzzles, and they actually participate in the International Speed Jigsaw Puzzle Competition, which I thought was quite interesting to watch. This is what the International Jigsaw Puzzle Federation would show you if they were showing you the actual presentations. This is actually an aerial shot of these people during their competition, and they actually go through something that I found very intriguing, and that's that they have a very exact process with which they actually solve these puzzles. They start out by dumping out the box, and they turn all of the pieces right side up. Then they orient them for direction when it's possible, and they decide on the corners, the edges, and the colors and whatnot. And you would think that this is actually a very kind of time-consuming process, but it makes it fast enough for them to actually solve a 500-piece puzzle in 30 minutes, which is kind of cool. So the reason I bring this up is because when I look at medical device documentation, this is actually something that I kind of do, but not maybe that perfectly. I have a real process for how I approach my documentation, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, about some of the ways that you can organize your documentation to kind of solve some of these regulatory puzzles that you run into, and some of the problems of making documentation that your users actually want to read. So let's take a look at that. We'll dump out the box, and we'll start talking about how some of the regulatory bodies that we have shape your content, and some of the conflicting interests that you might run into. Who are you actually writing for? It's called often user documentation, but in fact, regulatory is probably the first person who's going to be reading your IFUs. And finally, I also want to talk about how you can embrace the IFU as a multi-purpose document. It seems like something you don't normally want to do. You want a clean, streamlined document, but you don't have that option available to you. So how can you make this multi-purpose document really your friend and make it actually do all of the things that you want it to do? So we'll embrace that a little bit. So we'll start by identifying the corners, the regulatory bodies in this case. Then we'll start looking for the framework. What are the conflicting interests? And finally, we'll fill in the middle by thinking about all of the purposes that your document has to fulfill. So what are the regulatory bodies that you have to work with? I work with two primarily, which is the MDR, the Medical Device Regulation, and the FDA. And the MDR has a set of regulations that came into effect in 2021. And a key process for that, something that's important, is you have to have a clear quality management system. Once you have that, then you can usually run forward from that. A big change for them with the MDR from the MDD, the device directive from before, was that even if there's no clear risk, there's clearly no reason why you would need to do this. All of the IFUs have to be reevaluated and rewritten and so on, and reproven to be quality devices before you can start releasing your products again. So even products that we've had in our rotation for 10, 20 years all have to be reapproved by the regulatory bodies. Significant for the MDR is also that it isn't actually the government that's checking the documentation, as is the case for the FDA. It's an organization that has been approved by the EU to do the regulations. So in our case, that would be the TÜV here in Germany. They would do the testing for that. And they provide the little CE label that you might have seen on documents and so on. In contrast, the FDA has very similar requirements. They also have a quality management system, but they're much more concerned about whether or not there is a comparable device for the one that you're trying to release. And that's an important part of it. If there isn't one, then the steps get much more complicated. For a lot of companies, it's very important to sell in as many markets as possible. It's just not profitable otherwise. So they might also want to work with the Medical Device Single Audit Program, the MDSAP, which argues that if you have one organization for all of your regulatory practices, then actually there's more oversight, so you can actually identify more problems faster. And finally, there's also other regulations or standards. I'll mention these briefly as we go through, such as the international standards, the ISO, or the IEC for medical electrical devices. So how can regulatory bodies actually shape your content? They have very similar requirements in many cases, but sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch. And we'll talk a little bit about what kind of mismatch you might have, and whether it's possible or a good idea to have parallel documentation, and also a little bit more about other standards and requirements. So can one document do it all? Can you have one IFU that covers the MDR requirements and the FDA requirements? The answer is sometimes. It often works that you can have all of your documentation do it for all of your markets, but there may also be some points where it doesn't match up very well. So what if there's a mismatch? What if you have a compatibility issue, for example? Both the MDR and the FDA actually require that you include all of your compatibility for things like instruments. So if you have software and it has compatible instruments, you have to list all of those. And if you have an instrument in your compatibility list that is not sold in both markets, then you have a mismatch. And that might actually require you to have parallel documentation, so separate versions of the same thing. Another instance might be with something like a feature. Maybe you have a cool new feature that your product can do, but it hasn't been approved in the other market. So you might have to have either temporarily 2 versions of your software, or another possible solution would be to sell a previous version of the product only in that one non-compatible market. So that's another option that you might have. And finally, there might be a mismatch with simple things like terminology. And I can give you an example of this for a product that I'm working with, where we do cranial reconstruction for patients in the trauma. And in some cases, in the EU, we would call this cranial maxillofacial surgeries or use cases, but the FDA calls it craniofacial. And the difference is actually quite small. In the EU, this would include the lower part of the jaw, but in the US, this would only be the cranial and the bone structure in the back. So we actually have parallel documentation for a one-word change. So what about other standards and requirements? I mention this because the ISO and the IEC are both important in that they help to provide some of the shape of the content that you have. If you have a medical electrical device, you might very well have to include information about changing a battery, which is another regulation here in Europe. Or you might have to include cleaning standards, disinfection, which might be slightly different in the US. That might also cause some sort of mismatch, but also will provide some of the actual structure to your documentation. So what else shapes your user guide? Who is your audience? Who are the people that are actually reading your IFU? Now, the primary reader that you have is not necessarily the reader that you want reading your user guide, and that would be regulatory and testing houses. They're the ones that look at it first. They're the ones that determine whether or not it has all of the bits and pieces that it needs in order for your product to be sold. However, what they want to see is not necessarily what your product users, your surgeons or your patients or your cleaning staff want to see. It's going to be a little bit different information. And the third thing that you would want to make sure that you are aware of, even if you're not writing specifically for them, is your competitors or hackers, because they're also reading your user guides and they're looking for ways to deconstruct your product, to reverse engineer it, and figure out all the tricks of your particular product. So what if your IFU has conflicting interests? What if your users actually want very different things? Can you please everybody? I would actually say that the answer to this is maybe. And even maybe more of a yes, because I think that you can get your IFU with some careful manipulation of your text. You can actually pretty much determine how to get all of the information in there that you need. So for regulatory, for example, the information is usually fairly straightforward. It's facts and figures and specific wording that they want, and it's very finite. It's information that you can control. You don't have to write it in any particularly friendly way. It's fairly neutral language. You put it in, and either you fulfill the requirement that they have or you don't. Actual users, on the other hand, are looking for very different things. They want information such as how to use the product and what's going to happen if they don't use the product correctly. What are the use cases for that? And maybe you have a totally different way of writing for them. Your language is different. With my company, for example, we tend to address the user as you, and that's okay. And finally, for the hackers, you don't want to write stuff for them. To give you an example where we actually did change some documentation for this, we, a few years ago, had a clickable link inside of our user guide that would direct the user to another page that would tell them what Microsoft updates they should not install. And it was decided that we would take the clickable link out. The information stayed, but the clickable link was taken out because it was too easy to automatically find a mistake in our material. You could more easily determine what made our software not work in this case. So we changed that. The user still got the information they needed, but the hackers, it was a little bit harder. So what kind of things can you do to control your user guides a little bit more? This mismatch containment, as I've called it here. Some things you have control of and some things you don't. So for example, is your IFU strategy for your organization one document or is it many? If you have one overall document with a lot of different audiences in it, so your regulatory information, your user documentation, and so on, is going to be a very different approach than if you have 10 different documents that are very clearly focused. So if you have lots of documents, lots of different audiences in different ways, go for that. That's a great strategy. You probably can't change that, but it's something to be aware of. Not so much because you can change it, but just because it helps you decide what you can control, which includes, for example, the order of the information that you have in your IFUs or the organization of that information. But also, for example, if you have regulatory information in your IFU, you can organize it in the same order as it comes up in the regulatory information, in the requirements, so that it's very easy to find and easy to check. Along the same vein, you can use headings and titles that match the sort of regulatory information that you need. The terminology that you use, for example, should be very similar all the way through. These are all ways that you can control the way that your document is read. And finally, this is a silly one, but actually your index terms, because you may or may not have an index in your IFU. In some cases, it's a requirement, but it's actually a great way to throw in terminology for things like other synonyms for terms for products or use cases that you might not have a way to identify otherwise. This is a great way to do that. All right, so why would you want to embrace an IFU as a multi-purpose document? I've been saying that this is something that you should do, and actually I really do believe this is true. There are some advantages and some disadvantages to it. What do you lose by having a multi-purpose document? Yeah, you're missing out on some clarity. Maybe your documents are not as easy to read and small and tidy to work with, but at the same time, you also gain some information. You can make it a multitasking document because maybe it means you have less things that you have to release in the end. So it's easier to manage one document than it is to manage 10, obviously, at the same time. So this is actually an advantage in my book. I know that when we release a product, it's one IFU, but there's also about 50 reports that other people have to file as well. And what opportunities does it create to have a multi-purpose document? I would say one, it teaches you to really look at your document, you're writing very carefully, to think very carefully about your audience. How can you specifically target your language to work best for that particular audience? But it also gives you an opportunity to kind of question your documents and figure out what's missing. What opportunities are you missing? What could you create as, say, an extra document that your users could really benefit from? An example that I could give you is perhaps a quick reference guide. Maybe you can provide something that is more illustration heavy and text light that really helps your user, that your regulatory process currently does not have room for. Another possibility might be to take a careful look at how you use your images in general. Images really do say 1,000 things, 1,000 words. So you could actually use this opportunity to really evaluate your documentation and make sure that your images are working hard for you. A final thing I might add is that also if you find some organization that really does work for you in a multi-purpose document, you can apply this to all of your other documentation for your other products. The positive side of this is that you are then creating a real brand identity for your product. So this is something that you can apply over and over again. And it's also a way to help your team, especially if you have new members come into your team, to better understand what their product is supposed to look like. So it actually helps with onboarding as well if you have a really clear outline and purpose for your product. So why am I talking about all this? Why does this really matter? So what it all comes down to is, first, every medical device must meet regulatory requirements for every market that it is sold in. You cannot change this fact. This is just where you are working from. But I strongly believe that you can create coherent and useful IFUs that do reach multiple readers simultaneously. And this is just through a process of being careful and thinking through how your documentation fits together, like a puzzle, to find all of the pieces. You are not participating in the international jigsaw competition, so you do have more than an hour to sort all your pieces and put something together in a coherent way, even if it does sometimes feel like you have a lot of time pressure at the same time. And finally, I can't say this enough, you can, and I think you really should, embrace IFUs as multi-purpose documents. Instead of trying to make them fit into a narrow box, try to see how you can actually make that box more significant and more important than it already is. Make it work the way you think it should. It's up to you.
And that's a wrap for today's session. A huge thanks to you for walking us through the topic today. Insights shared tonight gave everyone a clearer understanding of how regulations shape the way we create and structure medical device documentation. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document360, then feel free to reach out to us. We'll be back soon with another session soon. Until then, see you next time.